Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we'll discuss the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 22nd November 2019. Now this article appears on page number 10 and is related to recent decision of the government to divest its shares in the public sector enterprises including BPCL, the Shipping Corporation of India and the Container Corporation of India. Now, this step is in line with the recent enthusiasm in the government to revive the process of disinvestment in India and becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 3 under the head Government Budgeting and Liberalization of the Economy. Now, in its recent decision, the government has decided to divest its shares in the central public sector enterprises including the Bharat Petroleum Corporation Limited, the Shipping Corporation and the Container Corporation of India in order to one, meet the fiscal targets of the government and two, to infuse a market mechanism in these public sector enterprises in order to realize the full economic potential of these organizations. Now this is done through a way of privatization which includes both sale of shares to the private party and also transfer of management control. Now, this step is in line with the recent revival of the strategic disinvestment policy of the government, under which the government is all set to lose its control over some of the public sector enterprises in line with the philosophy of less government, more governance. Now, the decision to divest its shares in these public sector enterprises is on account of failure to meet its fiscal deficit targets due to low collection of tax revenue and non-tax revenue alike. In that, the tax revenue target that has been accomplished in this fiscal is only around 35% and the non-tax revenue that is achieved so far is only 12,000 crores out of the target of 1,05,000 crores in this fiscal. As a result of failure to achieve these revenue targets, the fiscal deficit target of 3.3% seems to be unachievable now. As a result, in order to avoid this fiscal deficit slippage, the government has taken a decision to divest its shares in these public sector enterprises, which will enable the government to meet its fiscal deficit targets as well as infuse efficiency in this organization by way of privatization. Now, in this context, the author in this article is critical of the government move to divest its shares, especially in the Bharat Petroleum Corporation Limited, as it may lead to loss of dividends for the government. Now, besides, the author also highlights the timing of this disinvestment is too late in that the proceeds of this step will only be realized beyond this fiscal and thus requiring government to expedite this process of disinvestment in order to realize the proceeds as early as possible and avoid the resultant fiscal deficit slippage. Now, in this context, let us understand some basic terms related to this news article, including the difference between disinvestment, strategic disinvestment, and privatization. Besides, we'll also understand the evolution of disinvestment policy in India that will enable us to cover this topic in a holistic way. Now, in the aftermath of independence, the responsibility of national development was taken up by the government led by the public sector enterprises given the underdeveloped stage of private sector as a result of colonialism. However, given the bureaucratization and red tapeism in these public sector enterprises and the resultant inefficiency led to what is known as New Economic Policy of 1991, which is what we call as liberalization. One of the significant aspects of this policy of liberalization was the withdrawal of the government from some of these key public sector enterprises by way of shedding its ownership. Now, thus, disinvestment means sale of government shares in central public sector enterprises. On the other hand, when the government sells so many of these shares that it no longer remains the majority stakeholder of a given PSU, it amounts to what is called as privatization. Thus, while disinvestment is a generic term under which government decides to sell some of its shareholding in the public sector enterprise, under privatization, the government mandatorily has to sell so many shares that it no longer holds 51% shareholding in the public sector enterprise. Now, strategic disinvestment or strategic divestment is a fairly new concept under which the government not only sells its shares to the third party but also transfers the management control over the public sector enterprise. Now, in order to understand the difference between these terms, let us look at the policy of disinvestment in India. Now, as I've already mentioned, the disinvestment policy in India was adopted with the LPG reforms of 1991. Further, the disinvestment policy got consolidated between 1999 to 2004 in that a separate department for disinvestment was set up in 1999. Now, the proceeds of this disinvestment as a result of selling of government shares was accrued to a fund that was established called as National Investment Fund, which came into being in 2005. However, given the lack of political will and the reluctance of bureaucracy, the policy of disinvestment in this period has not yielded the desired results. Besides, it should be noted that the political and the bureaucratic control over these public sector enterprises has resulted in red tapeism and resultant inefficiency in these public sector enterprises. As a result, India being a market economy, and in order for these public sector enterprises to realize the full potential of the market mechanism, the need was felt to revive this policy of disinvestment and hand over these public sector enterprises to private sector and thus the market mechanism. As a result, the policy of disinvestment was revived in the year 2016, which was initiated by renaming the Department of Disinvestment into Department of Disinvestment and Public Asset Management, which is popularly called as DIPAM. Now, given the profit motive of private sector, some of the strategic sectors that affect large part of the population continue to be under larger government control, and the non-strategic public sector enterprises were thrown open for private participation. However, given the changing nature of the economy and inefficiency that has crept in these public sector enterprises, the government has felt the need for reviving this disinvestment policy in India today. Accordingly, under the current policy, the government has differentiated between disinvestment and strategic disinvestment. Now, under strategic disinvestment, the transfer of shares and transfer of management control is done to a strategic partner who could be a private entity or another public sector enterprise. Now, in case the strategic partner that is chosen by the government is a private entity, it amounts to what is called as privatization, under which both the shares and the management control of the public sector enterprise is transferred to private sector entity. Thus, strategic disinvestment is not necessarily privatization, and privatization is only a case of strategic disinvestment, under which the strategic partner chosen is a private entity. Besides, as it is clear, the objective of strategic disinvestment or disinvestment in general is twofold. One is refurbishing the government finances through the sale of government shares in public sector enterprises. Another is to bring in efficiency in these organizations to realize their full potential by way of privatization. Besides, given the inevitability of government control over certain key sectors that affect the national security and the population in general, the sectors that are chosen for disinvestment have to be carefully scrutinized. Now, in order for identification of these sectors for strategic disinvestment is done through an interministerial body headed by the finance minister and is called as alternative mechanism that was introduced in 2017. Thus, this interministerial body called alternative mechanism identifies the sectors for disinvestment, also identifies the strategic partner and other terms and conditions for transfer of shares and management control to the strategic partner. Now, having understood the difference between strategic disinvestment and privatization, let us understand the advantages of disinvestment as a whole. Now, as I've already mentioned, due to red tapeism and inefficiency, a number of public sector enterprises have become sick units, and the process of this disinvestment will help winding up of these sick units. Besides, transfer of management control to a private entity will help infuse best technology and management practices in line with the global best practices that is much needed in the changing economy today. Further, withdrawal of government control in these public sector enterprises will allow them to participate in the market mechanism and achieve full economic potential and make them competitive. Further, the proceeds of disinvestment adds to the kitty of the non-tax revenue of the government, thereby managing the fiscal deficits to the acceptable levels. Now, withdrawal of government control and bringing in private sector through the policy of disinvestment, particularly strategic disinvestment, is much in line with the government philosophy of less government and more governance, or in other words, laissez-faire. However, given the profit motive of the private sector, some of the concerns of disinvestment in general is loss of revenue for the government, particularly from those profit-making public sectors, as the government is said to lose out dividends of these profit-making companies, which is highlighted in the article. Besides, bringing in private sector may also create loss of jobs in these public sector enterprises that is known to be a major employer in the economy. Besides, while the alternative mechanism that we discussed will expedite the process of disinvestment, a clear selection criteria for choosing the strategic partner has to be given, which is currently done case to case basis. Notwithstanding the advantages of disinvestment, the profit motive of private sector may not yield in redistribution of resources in a country like India that suffers from a problem of large inequality. Now, as a result, as it is clear from our discussion, in a changing economy, the government, in line with its philosophy of less government and more governance, should expose these public sector enterprises to market mechanism to realize their full economic potential through the policy of disinvestment, but should also be in line with the long-term vision through strategic disinvestment, making these public sector enterprises efficient and competitive as per the demands of the time. Now, having understood the policy of disinvestment in India in a holistic manner, let's move to the next news. Now, this article appears on page number 11 and relates to subsidies in higher education. Now, this is in the context of recent unrest over hike in the hostel fee in JNU and becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 2 under Social Justice under the subsection Issues Related to Management of Education. Now, this article appears in the forum of an interview involving some of the experts in the field. Now, what I have done is collated the information in the usable form for the exam, particularly mains examination, under the heads Need for Subsidies in Higher Education, which have been identified by the experts in this interview, and also a novel model for subsidies in higher education that the experts propose that can be used in your mains answer. Now, given the historical social inequality in India on the basis of caste, class, region, religion, language, gender, etc., in the aftermath of independence, the government adopted affirmative action in that it provided reservation for what is called as mobility of this deprived section of the society. Now, in consonance with the same principle, the experts here emphasize the importance of subsidies in education, particularly higher education, in order to ensure mobility for these deprived sections, cutting across the barriers of caste, class, region, language, and gender. Therefore, the experts advocate the need for subsidy in order to ensure mobility of backward sections of the society. Besides, as it is well known, a number of graduates from the premier institutes like IITs, IIMs, etc., in search of better opportunities, have migrated to Western world. Now, this is what is called as brain drain, as you must be aware. While better opportunities in the Western world play an important role, one of the important factors for this brain drain is high cost of higher education in India. As a result, in order to reverse this trend of brain drain, the subsidies in higher education can incentivize these graduates to pursue higher education in India. Besides, an incentive in the form of subsidy in the higher education promotes the culture of research in India. Besides, completion of higher education has windfall gains as education is directly correlated to a number of development indicators including health, the per capita income, the poverty levels, etc. Thus, the subsidies in higher education through its windfall gains helps in achievement of holistic development of individual, which results in inclusive growth for the economy as a whole. Now, having identified the importance of subsidies in higher education, the experts here advocate an alternate model of subsidies unlike the present one, which is universal in nature in that the subsidies are benefiting everyone alike and thus a burden on the public exchequer. Alternately, the experts provide for a model of subsidies that is based on a graded system under which, depending on the background of the candidate, a deprivation point is assigned and the subsidy is allotted proportionately. Thus, this alternate model advocates for disbursal of subsidies in a proportionate manner based on the background of the candidate. Besides, the experts also highlight that currently there is a disparity in the amount of subsidies that are granted to different institutions. In that, while the premier institutions, including the IITs and IIMs, get a higher amount of subsidy, the institutions in the far-flung areas do not get the adequate amount of subsidy. Besides, this disparity is not only based on the region but also based on subjects, in that the subject based on engineering, technology, science, etc. get a higher amount of subsidy compared to the liberal arts according to the experts. Therefore, this unevenness in grant of subsidies to higher education institutions should be removed, paving way for development of all fields of education alike. Now you may use these points in your mains answer writing, one on need for subsidies, and the alternate model may be used as a way forward in your answers relating to higher education. Now with this, let's move to the next news. The researchers from Indian Veterinary Research Institute have concluded that the reason for the recent mass deaths of birds in the Sambar Lake in Rajasthan is Avian botulism, a neuromuscular illness of the birds which is caused by a bacteria. Now, in this context, this news appears on page number 5 and becomes important from the perspective of preliminary examination. Botulism in general is a bacterial disease caused by the bacteria Clostridium botulinum. While these bacteria are harmless under normal environmental conditions, under these conditions, these bacteria germinate and begin to produce toxin-producing cells. So let's have a look at these environmental conditions under which this bacteria produces toxic cells. Now these toxic bacterial spores are abundant generally in anaerobic habitats, those which lack in oxygen and also nutrient-rich environments. Now a mix of these environmental factors of low oxygen and nutrient-rich environment are generally found in soils, the aquatic sediments, generally in wetlands and lakes, and are also known to be found in the gills and digestive tracts of a healthy fish. Now the fish-eating birds that consume this infested fish are poisoned by Clostridium botulinum, causing a neuromuscular illness in these birds, leading to paralysis in their legs and wings. Besides, the carcass of these birds are ingested by maggots and are widely found in the environment. Now, these infested maggots or the carcass of an infected bird, if consumed by any other animal or humans, can cause this bacterial sickness called botulism. Therefore, from the perspective of prelims examination, you need to understand that botulism is a bacterial disease. It causes a neuromuscular illness in birds. It can also infect other animals and humans. And the important environmental factors that are germane for production of these toxic bacterial cells are low oxygen and nutrient-rich conditions. With this, let's move to the next news. Now, this article appears on page number 1 in the context of a recent visit by the External Affairs Minister to Sri Lanka in the aftermath of the victory of the Rajapakshas in the presidential election. Now, in this context, this news becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 2, International Relations under the subsection India and Neighborhood. Besides, another article appears on page number 10, which discusses the politics of Sri Lanka today. In this context, though this article is not directly important from the exam perspective, in order to understand Indo-Sri Lanka relations, it is advisable to have a fair idea about the politics in Sri Lanka today. Now, understanding the key actors in Sri Lankan politics with respect to India, now the Rajapakshas who have won the presidential elections have historically favored China, are hostile to minorities like Muslims and Tamils, and generally considered to be authoritarian in nature. On the other hand, the Sirisena Vikramasinghe coalition favor India, support the minorities, especially the Tamils in the north and east of Sri Lanka, and are also considered to be democratic in nature with respect to the democratic institutions provided by the constitution. Thus, in this context, the urgency of Indian External Minister to visit Sri Lanka and engage with the Rajapakshas is on account of this Tamil factor in Indo-Sri Lankan relations that has been one of the major factors between the two countries. Now, Indo-Sri Lankan relations are historically dominated by the Tamil factor in that India has been pushing for greater devolution of power to Tamil minorities in north and east of Sri Lanka, which was pushed by India even in the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord of 1987, which provided for a proposal for 13th Amendment through which greater devolution of powers in the north and east to Tamil minorities were to be given. However, as I have already mentioned, the Rajapaksha regime has historically seen this as an interference in the domestic matters and are generally hostile to the minorities in Sri Lanka. Thus, the new election results could delay the process of devolution of powers to Tamils and justifies India's urgency to meet the Rajapakshas to persuade them in the Tamil matter. In the backdrop of the results of presidential election in Sri Lanka, this issue was comprehensively covered in DNS analysis of 18th November 2019. So I would suggest you to go through the DNS analysis. With this, let's take up the practice questions. Now, this question is framed on the basis of this news that appears on page number 8 on a famous Vedic festival that is celebrated once in 6 years in the Padmanabha temple. The Vedic ritual is called as Jalajapa, in which the Vedic scholars from multiple states chant the Vedic hymns in front of the pond, as you can see here. So this question reads, Murajapam, a centuries old Vedic ritual, is celebrated once in 6 years in which of the following states? So as I have already mentioned, this Vedic ritual called Jalajapam, which is a part of Murajapam, is celebrated in Padmanabha Swami temple once in 6 years, which is in the state of Kerala. So the right option here is B, Kerala. Coming to the next question, consider the following statement regarding botulism. The first option says it's a fungal disease. As we have discussed, botulism is caused by a bacteria. So this option is wrong. It can affect animals, birds and humans alike, which is true, and hence the answer to this question is B, 2 only. Now coming to the next question, the 13th Amendment in the context of Sri Lanka is related to which of the following? Now, as I have already said, India has been continuously pushing forward for devolution of powers in Sri Lanka, and this 13th Amendment is related to devolution of powers, and hence C is the right answer for this question. With this, we come to the end of today's discussion. Now let's take up the question for the day.